Hello, my name is Luke Hoffman, and today we're going to be talking about how gender and sexual orientation affect what jobs individuals take, not only what jobs are available, but what jobs individuals usually go into, and then also what happens when they're in that job. Do they face discrimination, harassment? Are they fired unfairly? Things like that. I think it's important to talk about why I'll be looking into this and why I chose this to research. And I think a lot of the times people will choose topics that they know a lot about, which makes sense because they feel comfortable with it. They can teach it. They can talk about it more. But I chose this because it's a topic I don't really know a lot about. So I feel as if while I'm researching it and talking about it, I can kind of learn too, along with the listener. First, talk about what some LGBTQ plus people get into as their jobs, what they're more likely to get into. And one of the first research articles I looked into this and looked into what they're likely to go into. And they found not a ton of significant data, but one thing they did find that was extremely significant was when it came to what fields gay people were most likely to go into. And what they found was actually that if that job is dominated by pretty much all men, gay people are less likely to go into that. They're more likely to go into a job which is greater diversified when it comes to gender. So if there's more females in that job, they're more likely to go into that. Now, what the research article states is that they go into job fields like that because they're trying to limit the amount of discrimination they'll face. And I think I agree with that too. I think when we look at research articles that I'll talk about later on that talk about the discrimination, where this article just talks about, the findings of where they're going to go into. When we talk about that, it'll make a lot more sense why people are going to these job fields. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about some of the discrimination that some of the members of the LGBT plus community are facing. We're going to be looking at a report of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. And some of the statistics are truly scary. The first statistic that gives a little bit more context to what we've been talking about is that they found that 90% of those surveyed reported experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. So that just gives a lot of context what we've just been talking about. If these people in the LGBT plus community are experiencing harassment, pretty much almost every single one of them, 9 out of 10, it makes sense why they're going to be worried about where they can go into their job. I mean, that's something that they're always going to be having to think about, and they're going to try and limit it to the max that they can. Not only are they going to be trying to limit it, but it seems as if they're also being fired at a higher rate. Over 1/4 reported that they had lost a job due to being transgender or gender nonconforming, and 50% were harassed. So if you're harassed, I mean, you really cannot stay at that job, I'm sure. And then 26 are being fired. I mean, how many are really going to be able to just have a job and carry it out like any other person would? It's going to be almost impossible. It's not only that, but think about how hard these people's lives are as soon as if they're dealing with harassment at work, if they're fired. I mean, a job is extremely important. I mean, this study also found that when people were let go of these jobs or they were harassed at work, they felt as if they had to go into things almost like it talks about an underground economy, so that these people are going into sex work. They might start doing drugs, things like that. Like, this is making a huge impact on their lives when they're not allowed into certain areas of work, when they're harassed at work, when they're fired from their job. I mean, it can ruin their lives, truly. So I think now it's important to look at what is the government doing for these, what type of legislation is being passed to stop this discrimination. So this report is called LGBT, workplace inequality in the federal workforce, intersectional processes, organizational context, and turnover considerations. And it's a pretty long article, but one of the main ideas is that the government is not doing enough. So here's a quote from it: less than half of U.S. states prohibit workplace discrimination on the basis of sexual identity, and even fewer include protections for transgender workers. So I think it's easy to blame it on these business owners who either aren't hiring or not running a good enough business where people aren't being harassed or are firing LGBT plus members. But we also have to remember that there needs to be some type of legislation by the government protecting them, making it so that they cannot be discriminated on. And I mean, just look at several years ago when Donald Trump made that ban on transgender people in the military. It's easy to say like, oh, they're a distraction, and then that way they don't have to hire them, or and business owners can do the same thing that he was saying, and it's just claim that they're a distraction, and then it's fine to either fire them or not worry about their well-being. It needs to start from a government level where we're prohibiting that stuff. It's against the law, and there will be sanctions against your business if you're letting them be harassed, if you're not hiring them, or if you're firing them just because they are transgender or gay. This stuff's going to be extremely important that we get legislation out there. So I think it's kind of a good place to recap what we've already talked about and try and apply this into the real world. So we know that, to begin, LGBTQ plus members they have to kind of select jobs where they feel like they'll face less discrimination before they've even got into that job. So they need to think about what they're doing always, where I think regular people, they don't need to be as picky, like it's like you kind of just have to go in to understand like the environment that you're going to be going into, whereas LGBTQ plus members have to always be thinking about that before they're even on the job. What's a environment that's going to foster a healthy workplace? And then also, obviously, transgender people are being discriminated against. It's really horrible what's happening. I mean, they're being fired just because they're transgender. Almost all of them are facing some type of discrimination, harassment, something like that. It's even worse for them. And then the government really is not doing anything to help them. At least it still isn't enough. There are times when it's actually hurting them more than anything. And so when we look at like how important a job is in someone's life, this is really, really an important place. We need to be honest about how hard it is for them to get a job, to keep a job, to have a healthy workplace, because that's such a big part of their lives. So let's talk about what's happening right now. Let's talk about the future. And I know it's such a terrible topic to cover and talk about because it is so terrible that, what's happening to transgender, what's happening to gay people in the workforce. But there is some hope. In 2020, there was a court case that went to the Supreme Court, Bostock versus Clayton County. And what that did was it did clarify that there cannot be any anti-transgender discrimination in employment. And so that's huge. It makes it so that they have basis if they would go to court to, sue these workforces. Over 1 in 4 of them are being fired unjustly just because they are transgender. This court case gives them the proper tools to fight those decisions in court. So to finish this whole thing off, I'd like to just talk about kind of like what I learned as somebody who didn't know anything about these subjects. And I think I could have told you before this that, they'll face some discrimination, but there are just some numbers that blow your mind when you're doing this research. Like 26% have been fired, almost 9 out of 10 have faced some sort of discrimination, harassment, something like that. Those are the transgender numbers. Gay people are having to go into jobs that maybe they can't go into their dream job. They have to do something that, they have to do a job where they're not going to face as much discrimination. I mean, this stuff is truly just much worse than even I could have thought. But I think there is hope, which is always good. And I think as more people learn about this, it'll come to a stop, and that's all we can really hope for.